and today we talk about validation in computational social science, which it has been a little bit of an obsession of mine since I began working with AI about 10 years ago. So I am co-director of the Tackling Hate Lab, which is a research group. We are basically a very diverse bunch. So I come from sociology, psychology. I publish in political psychology, criminology. Andrea, who's actually he's sick, so he cannot attend today. He's an econometrician. We have Qian Liao, who is an associate professor in data science here at Deakin as well. And we work with engineers, data scientists, statisticians. So we basically use a computational approaches to understand hate and extremism. So validation. So today, the session has the following structure. We talk about the problem. So why do we want to talk about validation? Why should we care? We will, based on the literature, we discuss a couple of approaches to measurement and validation in computational social science. I will present a case study. It's an article we are finalizing, and it will be submitted soon, in which we validate a couple of measures, a couple of machine learning classifiers, I have to say. And then we will do a group exercise to start thinking about how to validate classifiers. Okay, so the problem. Who knows what a latent social construct is? I'm not going to talk the whole time, also because I'm jet-lagged. So I will ask you a lot of questions. So what's a latent social construct? Who knows? Any idea?
Gordon. I assume it's a social construct that is something constructed by society, a phenomenon that is underlying and not immediately obvious.
Exactly. So it's a social, psychological, political concept which cannot be directly observed or measured. So it can be inferred from indicators, observable indicators. They can be behaviors, attitudes, responses to surveys, language, and so on. Examples? Any idea of examples? Polarisation. Perfect. Prejudice, hate, extremism, any really social phenomena, trust in government, social cohesion, I mean, you name it. So anything that we cannot directly see, but we can understand indirectly through linguistic patterns, network structures as well, and so on. So latent means, of course, hidden or underlying. One characteristic of social constructs is that the meaning is contested. So there is always a discussion about how we should define them. So yesterday I was giving a testimony to the Bondi Royal Commission, and the big issue was, how do we define anti-Semitism? So we were presenting data about anti-Semitism online between 2021 and 2026. And the only way we addressed the issue was to measure it in 10 different ways. So we said, look, these are the 10 ways. You can define it in many ways, but in any way we define it and measure it, we find the same trend. So meaning is contested. You have to know it is, and you have to do somehow something to address the problem that the meaning is not fixed and it's not one. Yes, please.
Does this mean it's potentially locally based. So like a version of a particular construct might be different based on like societal structure, or like geographic location or time-based. So you might see a different version of it happening 20 years ago, but you also might find a different version like in different parts of Australia or different parts of the world, or like in different social stratas.
That's a great question, and you are spoiling much of what we will discuss today.
Sorry.
No, but it's great, absolutely. So that's exactly the point. So usually the meaning is contested
That's fun.
in by social groups. And when I say contested, I mean that usually there are political aims behind the contestation. But certainly understanding how the concept changed over time, how the understanding and the actual, look, every phenomenon in society changes over time, right? Nothing remains fixed. But yeah, absolutely. So this is what I mean. We will come back to it, but when we think about measuring latent social constructs in computational data, don't limit yourself to language. So for example, now I'm part of a team and we are developing a measurement of social cohesion using network data. So network properties, not language. So there are many ways to think about measuring stuff online. So it's not just language. Okay, so clearly social science is all about latent social constructs. We rarely measure stuff that is not a latent social construct in research. So it's really a fundamental issue and a core element of social science research. Okay, what's the problem? The problem is that we use, and I given the example of cats, but there are many examples. We use the same approach to validate social constructs that we use to validate a classifier that captures or distinguishes between cats and dogs, right? So basically, I work with, and I'm sure you do, or maybe there are data scientists in this room. This is a classification problem. So which one of the pictures contains cat and not another animal or a plant? So basically, you get humans to label data and to say, okay, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is a dog, this is a cat. And then you develop a model that is able to replicate this labeling and to identify cats and not other animals or plants. This is called, determining which ones are cats in this data. This is called the ground truth. Are you familiar with the concept of ground truth? Did you talk already about it?
Great sessions, yes.
Sessions on ground truth, yeah. And look, the first time I heard about ground truth, really that made me cringe. And I'm sure many other people with a social science background did it, because what's the ground truth when we're talking about a social construct or problems in society? Who decides what is the ground truth? I mean, we're not talking about distinguishing cats from dogs. We are talking about who is an extremist, what is hate, what is polarization, and so on, what is misinformation. Who gets to decide? This is not a technical problem. This is a fundamental issue. Who gets to decide what is misinformation and what is not? And when something we say is fake news versus a fact, it's not a switch. It's not a cat or a dog. It's much more complex. Many of the things we say, I'm sure today I will tell you something inaccurate because I'm jet lagged and my brain doesn't work very well. So does that mean that I'm spreading fake news? So what's the threshold, right? If we don't have anything to back up what we say, Well, are we spreading misinformation? Critiquing power is fundamentally, most of the times, an exercise in which we propose interpretation of the world where we don't have, data to back up everything we say, but it's very important to be able to do that. So how do we set the threshold and who gets to decide? Well, it's not as easy as saying, oh, there is a ground truth, and let's benchmark our models against that. It's a little bit more complex. So validation, as I'm sure you know, and maybe I will skip the next slide if you have already talked about it, is all about understanding if our models capture the ground truth accurately. Nothing else. Did you talk about this already?
Let me do a refresher, then we could, yeah.
Okay.
We talk about this course.
Okay. So usually in data science, and now I am not a data scientist, so we'll make this very simple and potentially even trivial, but we use 4 benchmark categories or scores: precision, recall, accuracy, and the F1 score. I mean, there is much more than that. There's the AUC, the area under the curve, there is one, but I will focus only on those 4. Again, these 4 tell us, they do not say if they measure, say we're developing a classifier to measure hate speech. They do not tell us if the classifier measures hate speech or not. It just tells if, against the ground truth, our classifier is working accurately. So precision captures the percentage of predicted positive cases that are actually true positives. Recall is the percentage of actual positive cases identified by the model. Accuracy is the percentage of predictions correctly classified across positive and negative cases. And the F1 score is basically a harmonic mean. It's a simple formula to capture one unique coefficient that tells us the accuracy of the model. So basically, if the model works well in precision and less well in recall, it gives us a score that keeps that into account. It's all basically about how many false positives and how many false negatives. Again, I don't want to enter complex ethical issues, but we have to keep in mind that when we talk about cats and dogs, false positives and false negatives have a certain implication. It's about the model, if the model works. If we talk about, and we for example, in my work, many times police agencies ask us to develop models to identify extremist users online. Well, false positives and false negatives have a different weight and implication. So a false positive means that we are identifying someone who is not an extremist and we are telling police, this guy is an extremist. A false negative is even worse. We are not capturing an extremist, and maybe that person will go on and do something, and police will not be able to intervene because our model did not work. So, I mean, it's the implications are completely different when we talk about social science, and depending on the type of research you do. Of course, false positives and false negatives have deep ethical implications that we need to be aware of. Any question about this so far? Yes.
Very interesting, Matteo. So I'm just curious to know, how are you managing this issue of false negatives? Have you developed a system for the police authorities? And I think you mentioned that you had a conversation with them. So what's the conversation like when you talk to people who are essentially responsible for providing security?
Yeah, well, it's them, but think about platforms and tech companies. They use these models to identify content potentially breaching terms and conditions. So the answer is always the same. You need humans in the loop. The final decision needs to be taken by a expert or someone who can take responsibility for the decision, which has one big implication, which is that depending on the type of task you have to do, it's very expensive. So it needs resourcing. And that means that sometimes, police can or cannot do something. And that means that many times tech companies and platforms are not able to be on top of harmful content online. Because many times because they don't want or they have a political vested interest, and sometimes it's cost, right? Because it's very expensive. Please.
We had these two sessions, and I think everyone remembers. We had this session about theory of computational social science with Deakin, and we had another session with Richard Sinnott. And then they both had two different perspectives. So some was arguing that theory is very important, and then measuring the underlying, finding the way to measure underlying concepts that are driven by theory is important. And Richard was arguing that it's not really that significant. So he was saying that basically you have the data, you observe the data, and you see what's right and wrong. But basically, if 99% of your results are positive, and then 1% of your results are negatives, those 1%, that 1% is not really that important after all. So because you observe trends, and you don't really know the significance of that 1%. And I guess it also depends on the perspective. So you have outliers, right? And how significant are those outliers? And then the social scientists would tend to look at outliers as something important. But is it? Is it?
Yeah.
So I guess it's related to the issue of how false negatives are important.
Yeah.
What their importance, how their importance can be measured, I guess. That'll be the question.
Look, that's a really good point, Bogdan, but it depends. It's not just a disciplinary debate and a perspective. It's really about the type of research that you are doing. If you are working on terrorism, it has a very low incidence, right? But one person can do a lot of damage. So false negatives have a different weight when you are, studying terrorism than if you are studying dogs and cats, right? So it really depends on the project you're doing, how you're deploying and why, and who is deploying your tools and your classifiers to do what, and so on. Yeah.
I think it also depends on the structure of the social system that you're engaging with. So if we're talking about a legal situation where someone can be flagged as having done something when they haven't, if you have appropriate social systems in place to assist that person so they don't end up in jail, you can weight that slightly differently than if you have a system where it's incredibly expensive to get legal help, or you can go through the appeals process without proper assistance. It really depends on the structure in which it exists when you're balancing presumably false positives and negatives. I imagine in some circumstances, a higher set of false positives is actually fine, provided you can give people a solid process for demonstrating that they're not actually a false.
A positive.
That it's not actually, thank you. They're not actually a positive.
So
but I imagine that balance is very different under terrorism because, as you said, the implications are so large.
Yes. Of course.
Yeah. So I guess
needs to be supported. It's also theory-driven. So the validation of false positives, measuring how important they actually are, finding a way to define what that measurement would be, whether it's a correct measurement. Sounds like a lot of work, right?
Yep.
If you have only 5%, about terrorism. So we have quite a few events, terrorist attacks over the last 100 years. So I guess in that way, if we're analyzing that and we have a theoretical framework, and we then test our theory empirically. And we identified that, okay, 5% of those terrorist events were about something else. They were not motivated by an ideology, but they were rather driven by personal convictions, right? Not ideological convictions, but something else, right? Anger or something irrational, right? So, but it's still, those need to be explained, right?
And does it matter? Does it matter? I don't know. I don't think so. Yeah.
But if you really think about it, those are significant. Those are terrorist events.
Yes. So these metrics, basically, just to conclude, they are understood in what we call a predictive benchmark framework. So they are about a learning problem, so a specific prediction target. They are about having a standardized data set that usually is split between the training and the evaluation data set. And then the evaluation metrics are used and they are presented with a public leaderboard, basically ranking the models by the scores obtained. Okay. So that has created, and I apologize to my data science colleagues, which I love, a horse race of models. And in my field, for example, models looking at hate speech, it's basically the whole literature in data science is about beating the best model. Okay, so we have a model that has a F1 score of 0.91. Oh, we want 0.913. And then we publish another paper to show how good we are. Well, no one asks, are we really measuring hate? What is hate? What is that we are measuring, right? And looking into the data sets, because basically everything, all the horse race is based on, usually, most of the times, available data sets, right, online. Who annotated this data? And how? What does the data reflect? And potentially you have multiple coders annotating the data. Maybe they come from different backgrounds. Maybe you have incredible amounts of noise in the data because different people labeled hate in different ways, depending on if they were males or females, young, old, belonging to certain ethnic, linguistic groups, whatever. So all this literature skips, which is really important. I mean, we all use these models, so it's very important. But it skips the question, what is that we are actually measuring, right? Hate is a latent construct, so it's not just a complex engineering and data science problem. It is a social problem, right? So this issue is usually disregarded. So there is no one looking deeply into what is hate and whether if hate is a latent social construct. So it's a phenomenon happening in society. When we do our studies with these machine learning classifiers, capturing hate in social media, for example, are we capturing that phenomenon that happens in society or not? So the solution to this is a validation framework. I didn't come up with it. Well, initially I thought I came up with it, and then I searched, and of course I didn't, because other people thought about it before. So these are 3 papers, really good, published in 2025. Hopefully in a few months there will be our paper out. It's an emerging discussion, so you will not find a lot. You will find a few papers on the topic, and the idea is basically to borrow concepts from psychometric theory and construct validation from psychological and social sciences and use them to start thinking about how to validate our machine learning classifiers beyond the usual. Very important. I mean, I'm not saying we do not have to use the F1 score, precision, recall. I mean, they are important, but we need more when we develop classifiers capturing social constructs. I can share the papers. They're very easy to find online. Just Google them and you can find them. Okay, so validation, but we will see it in a minute. It's not as easy as the 4 criteria I showed you before. It's more complex. It's not a checklist. It's more a approach. Imagine you are an investigator and you need to find evidence that cumulatively tells us whether and to what extent and in which context the classifier we have captures the latent social construct. So let's look at the approach that we have to use. I think a good start to think about validation is understanding how validation is understood in social science and psychology. So this is a scale. I've been working with surveys a long time. I still do. This is one scale I have developed and published. If you Google Hate Behaviours Scale, you will find the article where we propose the validation. So the whole article is developing and validating a new scale. And I think, in the future, we should do the same in relation to machine learning classifiers, like do all the validation stuff, publish an article where we transparently report all the validation scores, in which data sets, etc. That is an article. And people who want to use that classifier, they can, provided with all the limitations and, let's say, validation that is publicly available. Okay, so we wanted to capture intentions to engage in hateful behaviors. We started thinking we need a theory, like we need someone who tells us what is the domain that we are looking at. What are hateful behaviors? How do we think about them? Where do they begin and where do they end? Where are the thresholds and the boundaries of the concept? So we used Gordon Allport, very important and famous psychologist who thought about the scale of prejudice, blah, 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 all that. So, okay, we got the theory, number one. You cannot do anything if you don't have that. If you don't have, when I say theory, it's simply understanding where the concept begins and where it ends. Because if you don't have clear boundaries, you don't know what you're measuring, right? So you need boundaries. Then we reviewed existing instruments, so existing survey questions in the literature capturing similar stuff. Prejudice, hate, racism. We lumped them all together in a very long list and we looked at it. And we said, okay, does this cover what Allport's scale of prejudice suggests or not? Are there any black spots? So we we selected 5 subject matter experts and we consulted with them, showing them the items we found, the definition of Allport, and we together in a session, we thought about, okay, this actually is missing. This is not reflected in the items. Or maybe, oh, look, all these items capture the same element. You don't need 100 items to capture this, but actually we need more items to capture that. Okay, so we did that. And we developed new items with the experts to capture the missing areas, conceptual areas within the definition proposed by Allport. Then we had this over-inclusive, long, redundant list of, I don't remember, maybe 100 items, 150, I don't remember the number, but very, very long. And we did one data collection. So we got, and I'm sorry for these people, we got like, I don't know, a few hundred people to complete the whole survey with all the items. And we did the first reduction. We used exploratory factor analysis to cluster the items together, understand which items were capturing the same construct and which items were capturing something else. So we started grouping items, and then we went through the list, and with the experts, we said, okay, we can remove this. They all ask the same thing. Let's keep one asking that thing. So we went through our reduction. We did this a couple of times, and we got to our 12 items capturing 3 subcontracts. So we had 3 subscales within our scale. Each subscale contains 4 items, each capturing a little bit different areas within the subconstruct. We tested and retested the same 12 items in different populations, so different data sets, and we made sure that the same statistical properties, so the items all clustered together, they all clustered within the 3 subdomains, remained in different data sets. And then we did other validation tests, which I will explain in a minute. But this is the process, okay? This is the process when you validate a scale. And this is exactly what we have to start doing when we think about developing classifiers. So I don't know what Richard thinks about this, but how do you start even thinking about classifying hate if you don't do this? You just grab 4 random people and you tell them, okay, tell me what is hate speech, okay, blah, 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 and then you do your benchmark scoring. Makes no sense, right? Yeah, no, you go.
I think we got a computer scientist here, and I think a lot of work.
Poor Mike, sorry.
And a lot of work we've observed, that a lot of work that's submitted about hate speech. It's very popular in computer science, but no one defines what hate speech is. They just saw there's this classifier, it performs with 98% accuracy, and then what's hate speech? Like they never tell you.
And then they publish another one. Oh, this is 98.2%. Yeah.
Goes to very good conference venues. What do you have to say about this?
Defend your discipline.
And if you're using the same data set, same matrix, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Improvements are improvements.
Improvements are improvements. Yeah, that's the idea.
I mean, as long as everything's fair, as long as they say, same data sets, things are not too bad,
It's an improvement.
As long as it's reproducible, obviously.
I agree.
It's not reproducible.
I mean, it's hard to do the theoretical work of computer science and design a model and at the same time pay attention to the theory because you're not an expert.
Maybe not no time for theory.
You got no time for this. Building a prototype, basically building a classifier. So,
yeah, that's why we have to work together, I guess. Yes.
Let's all write the paper, guys.
How do you? Another question. So, how do you make sure, like all the certification here, for example, stay valid? As your data evolves.
I'm coming. I think it's slide 15. It's coming.
Looking at some of these questions, let's take true for example. So I would not want a Muslim doctor. Like if you ask someone that specifically, there are definitely a group of people that would say yes, but there are a bunch of people that would say no but mean yes under different circumstances or different language. So how do you kind of reckon with the part where if you put it in the scenario about how Stacey might feel if she went to a doctor and it was a person from a background that she wasn't expecting rather than her regular doctor, and then like would she feel uncomfortable under those circumstances? Because there's a good chance that a whole bunch of people would say yes, who would say no to that question directly? Like, how do you deal with?
Yeah, absolutely.
You put it in a scenario, and all of a sudden you get different answers.
Absolutely. So this is quantitative research, right? You put reality into boxes and you look at average responses.
Sorry.
I mean, no, it's totally right. And the thing is, this is why this is not a diagnostic tool that we have to use for one person and determining the level of hate in that person. This is validated as a tool to use in populations, in survey data. So in certain subgroups, provided you have enough number of people, enough, say, statistical power for the analysis, you can compute the average level of hate for a certain subgroup and then compare subgroups. That basically accounts for individual variations, because on average, you get with a certain confidence, with certain confidence intervals, you get the average score for the group. So validating a scale means that when you have 12 items and you look at average scale scores and subscale scores across large groups, you can identify variation that is statistically meaningful for the group. Yeah. So it's not a diagnostic tool for the individual.
Recently just came out, published this year, rating responsibility networks, theory that's been put out about determining the ethical responsibility across all the various actors in using an AI program. Trouble is, it's a very complex calculation. It's very thorough. It's including things like causal contribution factor, foreseeability factor, intentionality factor, and the mitigation factor. Now it combines all these 0 to 1 scales to come up with a sort of a distribution of responsibility across the network. Fantastic. Problem is they didn't find any of those concepts.
No.
And I'm not actually sure you can measure intentionality, because how the hell are you going to do that? Lying is a thing. So
Yeah, no, totally. So when you start thinking in these terms and you start thinking about, okay, are the person who are publishing something where they measure this problem, are they actually thinking about whether they are measuring what they intend to measure, or they're just randomly, finding some ways to measure something and they don't know really if it's measuring what they want? Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
When you do the iterative refinement of, the questions that you have in the survey, do you talk to people as well? Do you do many interviews or sort of have them write down their answers? Do you get any more sort of deep qualitative data, or is it more about, like you explained, the variation?
Yeah, you absolutely can do that. Many people do. This is really the backbone of the validation process. But yes, so when you deploy a survey, in theory, you should always do a round of, say, qualitative interviews, even with people from that sample, trying to understand if they understand the item and the questions, how they understand them, and if there are potential in that population, say, unintended effects of the terms even that you're using, because maybe a certain term triggers some thoughts in certain populations and you didn't think of it, and then that can massively change the responses. So yeah, totally. So this is, it's not here, but we're using a 5-point Likert scale to collect the responses. So first of all, defining, right? And that's a lot of work. So recently, when was it? Well, in 2025, mid-2025, the Office for Social Cohesion of the Department of Home Affairs asked us, the lab, to come up with a new way of measuring social cohesion in online data. And they wanted us to do it. Just do it. And I said, how do we do it? So we convinced them to give us some funds to first think about what we were going to measure, which doesn't work well with government, but actually we managed to do it. And we wrote 2 papers, these 2. So, and published, you can find them online. There are 2 reports, pretty long. The first one reviews all the existing approaches to measuring social cohesion and assesses them. And the second one proposes this new idea that we think it's worth, a new conceptual framework to measure social cohesion. So we haven't still measured anything. We are actually in the validation phase now and collecting the data. But first of all, you need really to think hard about what you're measuring, why, and how people measured in the past, and so on. It's really labor intensive, but it's so important. So our definition of social cohesion, and this is the outcome of a really long paper, is it's a condition in which people, groups, and institutions with heterogeneous identities, views, and preferences are connected through durable, inclusive, high-quality relationships that enable collaboration towards collective goals across the whole society. Now, it's a lot of words, but we are translating that into mathematical equations to measure social cohesion as a network property, as a property of networks, right? And this is the paper we are writing now. So we're not looking at language, we're looking at network properties only, geometrical properties of the networks. Also based on the literature and a lot of existing studies, we think social cohesion as a network properties predicts other stuff. Okay, civic participation, trust in institutions, rule of law, and so on and so on. Each of these circles can be measured in many different ways. So there you go. We already have the structure that we need to start thinking about the measurement. So we have a definition. We can translate the definition into network properties. We have our scores. And then based on theory, we think that these scores will predict other things. And we know how to measure the other things, so we can do our validation tests. But without the theoretical work first, you don't know what you're measuring, and you don't know what to expect that thing that you're measuring to predict. So you are not able to do any validation. Any question? Yes.
Do you like your definition?
Did they like it? I don't think they understood it. So we'll see.
It doesn't really matter with them. Yes, probably you're the scientist. You define it.
Yeah, you define as long as you use it, and you can tell me then if social cohesion increases or decreases over time in some areas based on network data. You do it. No, I'm joking. I think they do like it. Yeah, they do like it so far. No.
So kind of the instant critique you can have of this is that you've made a definition of social cohesion, which probably won't align with everyone else's definitions of social cohesion, and then you're defining your measurements based on your own definition. So kind of is like, how is this significantly different? Like obviously a lot of other places won't even bother defining it, which is a different issue, but say someone else comes up with different definition of social cohesion and then makes different operational either. Well, sorry, forget the word.
Operationalization, yeah, whatever, yeah.
Like you can set that up. So kind of is this just an underlying issue that we're going to have with like various different definitions and methods of measuring, and then they're not going to actually align when we come to the end of it and be, oh, well, this person said there's this level of social cohesion, this person said there's this level.
Absolutely. But this is just our job as social scientists, right? So in these papers, this paper is all about saying, oh, this definition doesn't work because of this. Oh, this definition in Australia, they used it in Germany. Like in Australia, doesn't really work because there are First Nations people and you cannot measure social cohesion in this way because otherwise you discriminate First Nations people. And then these are the definition, blah, blah, blah. So we explain why we don't use any of the existing definitions. It's about having a rationale. And then in the second paper, we say, okay, having said all that, how do we do this? And then you come up with some idea. Okay, this is an important element. Well, these should be measured as well. This is also important. How do we put it all together? Bang, and you have a justification, right? Because this definition is not only justified by limitations in the existing definitions, but it's justified by our aim to measure social cohesion in social media data. So we need a definition that works for that specific type of data. And we explain why our definition, we think it works, because it allows to capture network properties which can be inferred by looking at certain indicators that exist in social media. So it's all along the whole thing, it's a big justification to explain why we have this. Now, you can say it's arbitrary. Well, yeah, yes and no, because we actually spent a lot of time thinking and explaining why it's not really arbitrary, but it's the optimal solution. So if someone comes up with an alternative definition that takes everything into account, that can be used in our data, that explains why it works in Australia, why they measure what they measure, well, welcome. But I mean, it's yeah. That's the job, I guess, of a social scientist.
So I'm assuming that you also conducted surveys or interviews while you were trying to write these papers, just to understand the process.
No, just literature.
Okay. I was wondering if you were actually planning to speak to first issue.
It's very important. Can I be honest with you? They don't give enough money. I mean, it's in the end, it's about also the resources you have. So I wish we had all the money. Yeah. But it's the validation work is extremely expensive and it's always constrained by resources. Yes.
I just had a quick question about how many layers down do you go? So if you go to this next slide, you've got, oh, no, sorry, actually, where the definition was, that was the right slide, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
So you define social cohesion, but you have components to it, right? You have durable, you have high quality. How many layers down do you have to go to also define what is high quality? What is durable?
Yeah. So that's the whole paper. But basically, we identify three main components. And then we have lists of potential ways to measure each component. And that depends also on the data, because social media data is, what is it? It's a lot of things potentially. So we are doing our first validation using X data. And in that data set, there are specific ways to measure which are, more suitable than others. So you have lots of potential candidate measurement approaches. Yeah.
Would it be fair to say we can come up with all kinds of definitions, but would it be fair to say we only know that the definition is correct? The only way to know that the definition is correct is to actually apply something that's based on this definition and then see the outcome. If the outcomes measured negatively, or if the outcomes not satisfactory, means the underlying definition might be correct.
That is absolutely correct. So this is only the first step. And then we have to do our validation. And maybe the validation, like all good research is high risk. I don't know how the validation will go. I mean, now, I don't know what you think. It's a personal opinion, but I think that research, which is not high risk, so when you start your project, if you already know the outcomes of your project, well, don't do it. We don't need it, right? We need research when you don't know what you will come up with. And that is good research when it's high risk. So we don't know. Maybe the validation will not work. And we will tell the government, you wasted all your money. Bye. I don't know. Yeah.
Are industry reports or NGO reports, because they're also trying to define some of this stuff. Or you also get only tempted to look at academic articles, journal articles, because essentially you're trying to define this for the government. Or also, how did you deal with that sort of thing?
Very. So this paper is 60% civil society measuring social cohesion in Germany, Chile, whatever, all the places. Yeah, very. Okay. So let's talk about validation now that we have left 20 minutes. Good. So the best validation papers, and this is one, I don't know if you heard that name, Cronbach. It has a Greek letter usually attached to it, so it's that guy who explains the four main concepts we have to think about when we conduct the validation of a measurement. So criterion validity, which is split usually in two, predictive and concurrent validity, content validity, and construct validity. Then under construct validity, subsequently other people added subtypes, so convergent, discriminant validity. Look, there's a lot of types of validity. This is what I see usually in my field, but there is more, okay? So it's a complex field, and there are many different ways to skin the cat. I don't like this expression, but anyway. So content validity is basically asking whether your measurement tool covers all the theoretically relevant dimensions of the construct. So remember, we wanted to measure hate behaviors. We based our measurement on Allport's definition of the scale of prejudice. So based on that definition, do the items we have cover all the theoretically relevant dimensions? So Allport describes prejudice as one thing. Do we cover all, or are there blind spots? Number one. Number two, criterion validity, which means, does your evaluation correlate with a known validated standard? Now, let's go to concurrent first. So this is what data scientists do all the time. They get the ground truth. That is the validation standard. Okay, they get humans to label data concurrently. So it's the same data set validated at the same time. And then they compare their classifier, the decisions of their classifier with the decision of humans. So this is basically looking at concurrent validity. Predictive validity is kind of the same thing, but it's about evaluating downstream future outcomes, right? So real world behaviors, for example. Does our measurement of hate targeting Muslims capture future hate crime targeting Muslims in the same context? If yes, we have predictive validity. If not, it doesn't. Construct validity. This is very important, and not many people do that. When I say evaluation, I mean like the measurement tool. It's a bit abstract, but does the measurement tool we have, does our machine learning classifier truly measure the intended construct? Okay. There are different ways to think about it. Structural validity, we will not talk about that today much, but it's about the structure or the clusters of the construct. So when we have our survey data, the question is, do the items cluster into 3 sub-scales as we predict, for example? Do they cluster in the way that we expect empirically? And then we have convergent and discriminant validity, which we will discuss today. And the question is, does our measurement correlate with other measures that assess theoretically associated constructs? So, for example, our measure of hate, does it correlate with, for example, toxicity? So measurement tools capturing toxic language. It shouldn't be the same, because if it's the same, well, we're measuring the same thing. It should be correlated. And discriminant validity, does it not correlate, or is it different from constructs that theoretically should be different? So hate and, I don't know, fear, they should be different, right? So if I capture hate and fear in my questionnaire or in my classification, then I should see the difference. Then external validity, do the findings generalize beyond the specific sample, setting, platform, context? And consequential validity is also important, but we will not look at it. There are too many. It's about the ethical, political, practical consequences of the measure. For example, we talked about the false positives problem in terrorism research. Do you have any question? It's a lot of information. I'm sorry. One last thing, people in validation literature distinguish between validity and reliability. Now, reliability is very different. Reliability is again, there are different types of measurement of reliability, but they are basically about the consistency or stability of a measure. So common types are internal consistency. So do the items measuring the construct produce similar results? And usually that is the Cronbach's alpha, speaking of Cronbach. Inter-rater reliability, this is commonly applied in relation to machine learning classifiers when we have multiple annotators annotating the same thing. Say I get 4 people annotating hate, you have to look at inter-rater reliability and test-retest reliability. So if we conduct the test 2 times in the same sample, do we get the same results? So different. So validity is not reliability. Look, I gave you a lot of information, and I really wanted to do at least skip all our stuff that's numbers. Why don't we do an exercise? So you split into your 4 groups. Okay, do you know which groups? Yes, everyone knows. And you pick one social construct that is relevant to your project. Okay? So you think about it, then we type the social constructs in the whiteboard, and then I will give you a few questions you have to think about in 10 minutes, and then you will tell us the answer to those questions. Constructs are? So this is Gordon, what did you pick? Newsworthiness. Oh yeah, nice. You guys? Same. I love it. Yes, it's nice actually to have the same, because I will see the 2 validation strategies. What? Populism. Oh, nice. Yes. And? No, oh, nice. And then what else? Did you decide? Privacy. Nice, beautiful. So, can you think, please? Now, now that you have the constructs, the exercise is about thinking about the validation strategy in detail. So I want to know which data you're going to use. I want to know how you're going to validate the data or your measurement approach using the concepts we have explored. I will give you one page with some ideas and questions that might help you to think about the validation strategy. You can pick whatever works. You don't have to do all of them. It's just for you to trigger your thinking. Just your thinking, and then we can, it's not, I don't expect a complete validation, also because I didn't present how we validated our measures. So I know you're going a little bit in the dark, sorry. Yes. So who wants to start? Anyone? Yeah, Gordon, you go.
Social construct is newsworthiness for the ANC. They look specifically at regional communities and news interest stories refined within 3 hours of audio maximum. So the criteria we've developed for that, based on established theory of that field, but also based on NBC's priorities, was impact, human interest, regional focus, location, analysis, and conflict. There's quite a bit of literature surrounding that in terms of measurement and ratings and so forth as well. But in terms of validation, specifically, there's predictive, looking at do they want to generate articles based on these priority things coming out of material, and therefore they should therefore predict whether or not people will get the articles. So we've got page hits there. We've also got discriminatory, because we're specifically focusing in on regional areas and regional communities. There should theoretically be a distinction between interest from those communities and the broader state.
Oh, that's a good one. Discriminant, not discriminatory. Yes.
Convergent, so those probably the two main ones.
Nice. Yeah, I like them. They're really good. Nice.
Oh, it's very similar to Gordon, but I think before learning from you is to get a literature review of what has been done already in newsworthiness. And I think for us, particularly relevance is really important, because what is newsworthy from one region, let's say in central Queensland, will be very different from regional Victoria. So I think that is very, very important. This will take a lot of money to validate though, because that means like doing a lot of groundwork within the communities themselves, especially if we're going to go with locality with news. And in regards to validation, we will have like lag indicators or behavioral metrics, which is listeners and audience engagement for that particular news story. And that can be whether share, likes, comments, engagement, social media, or even the number of listeners for that particular story. Discriminant, something that maybe we're thinking of that is different from newsworthiness, is emotional balance towards the story. And it would be also really good to talk to the local editors and journals to really develop what is newsworthy for that particular community that they want.
That's interesting. Nice. Thanks. Very good. Yes.
So we're working on populism. We're still deciding on which dimension to really focus on, but it seems like we're really just going to focus on the many dimension of populism. As far as how we would measure that, we have a few keywords we've been working on, like migrants, foreigner, alien, and immigrant first, right? We have, I guess, two data sets, right? We have ABC News data from 2016 to 2026, and Hansard Senate speeches from 2016 to 2026. We filtered the speeches for One Nation politicians. The ABC News data probably needs to be filtered a little bit more, but so far it's been filtered for One Nation, Australia, and immigration. And as far as the importance of validity, we're actually taking two different approaches to it. We're using a traditional topic modeling and sentiment analysis approach, vector regression analysis. On the one hand, that's mostly old school, stemming and filter words and whatnot. That's one. And then the LLM approach, which LLM assistant approach.
Yes, for the framing analysis, so using the theory of like framing comes from Handman, and then we operationalize what actually consists of this framing analysis, and then we will apply it to the analysis of the news articles to see like topics, dominant topics emerge, and then what kind of reports support that, and so on at the end, and then also like how they frame them differently between the speeches and also the news articles related to this topics of immigrations.
And we're sampling from the data set, right?
So we do sampling for the validations first, like using Cochrane for like so out of like 15,000 and something for the news article and 1,000 and something for the speeches. We will use each of them 300 just to do the validations test first before we apply it to the model. The total.
Nice. Can I ask you a couple of questions? So you use two types of data, right? Pauline Hanson's speeches and news. What's the hypothesis that Pauline Hanson will display more populist language than? So the ABC corpus is basically a comparison group.
Yeah, and then so a lot of the text analysis is, I guess, a bit more on the descriptive side, but on the vector autoregression, we started with the hypothesis that the speeches will impact the news, right? So basically, the more that they talk about anti-immigration, the more that they should be doing so as well, right? And eventually, we started testing it a bit. I started testing this yesterday with vector autoregression just to see if they impact each other, so to speak. And so far, it's a bit of a roller coaster. So in some cases it does, in some cases it doesn't. It depends on the topic within the news within the year, because there were some news articles in there talking about, for example, buyers during some of those years, and in those cases we saw less anti-immigration sentiment. Interestingly enough, at least in the regression analysis, although some of that anti-immigration sentiment was still there. The news article was still there, but there was less on the speech. So we're still playing.
Well, maybe because there are external factors affecting one and not the other. And
like even though, like for example, we already like sorted it also like to a specific party, and so we would want to know how they actually frame that specific party using that speeches. But then, like the result when we test to a very small sample is a different one, so they frame it a bit different. Like when it's from the speeches is negative, like burden, economic burden, and also like national threat. But then like for this news article, it's not. It's more like opportunities and university opportunities, and not seeing it as negative in their reporting.
But the question about validation is: are you actually measuring populism? So how do you respond to that question? Because populism it's a really tricky one. Newsworthiness, you have in mind, bang. How many people like it? Easy. Populism, what can be the outcome of populism? So I imagine you're measuring. So because if you measure populism in Hanson's speeches and in news media, in the ABC speech, you want to measure whether a society is becoming more populist? Is that what you want to measure?
We want to measure if the news is actually taking up more of those populist cues from populist politicians, which is why we filtered the speeches exclusively.
No, well, I get that, but the question is about the validation question is about your instrument. The question is your instrument measuring populism? So, what is populism? Number one, if you have that, then the question would be, what's the outcome of populism? Is it, I don't know, hate targeting immigrants? So how do we measure that? Well, we can get police records of aggressions targeting immigrants. And then when you plot your populism measurement over time, you should be able, in theory, to see if it correlates with spikes in real-world incidents targeting immigrants.
We're focusing on, since we did predominantly start as a sort of project as an immigration-related project. So we've been thinking of just focusing on immigration policies and immigration rhetoric, since populists typically adopt, very negative approaches. Would that pretty much fix the problem? So we just basically frame it as negative immigration-related speeches, and then on the speech side, and then on the news side, immigration-related articles. It's all about immigration policy and immigration news. Would that pretty much?
Could be. Maybe you can expect that more populism translates into more policy proposals to regulate immigration. There you go. So you can measure that. Absolutely. So it's about, finding what's the outcome and measuring if there is an association between your measurement approach and the expected outcome.
The also challenge
Please.
BBC groups
Please.
in a similar way. You folks talked about potentially relying on some metrics of popularity, views, likes, shares. Something to consider is how newsworthiness is different from clickbait or something that people actually like. Some news might not be very shareable. They might not be very fun. I think you kind of touched upon it when you talked about emotional balance, but it may be also slightly different thing that you might need to consider in terms of how is your instrument of relying on those measures distinguishes newsworthiness as opposed to clickbait, popular news, or this soft news, soft popular.
Absolutely. That's a good one. Yeah. Yes.
We're considering privacy kind of in quite a specific way, looking at data donation platforms. So you can get your big data extracts from social media. We're looking at chatbots and then asking whether or not someone would be willing to share a specific chat with us, or whether they would be, no, that's private, I don't want researchers looking at that. Considering privacy, it's very experiential. It's going to vary a lot from person to person. What is private to one person is not going to be private to someone else. So what we're thinking of is trying to build kind of a generalized flagging system where you feed in all your chats. You then, we're thinking of a classifier trained on a light-heart scale based on social media, privacy sharing settings, and also probably some human labeling, just spread across a lot of things. But plus some regex is very clear, like addresses, medical stuff, banking, API keys. We flag whether or not, hey, maybe you should consider not sharing this stuff with us. Then we present that back to them and we say, was that right? Are you actually okay with us sharing that? Are there other things that you're not okay with us sharing? And then we can kind of turn into a feedback loop and also validates the classifier in the process.
Nice. How do you do the validation?
So it would be comparing, so the validation of kind of this classifier here would be through, we made a classification and then we ask whether or not that classification is correct to the user.
As they're doing the data donation process.
I'm doing the data donation
And then
process.
we can collect that.
I get it. This works very well. Yeah, this is great. It's great. Really good. Nice. Well done. Yes. That is specific to the data donation environment. And so I guess the ultimate behavioral outcome is whether the user wants to donate that chunk of data or not. So this is what is the validation benchmarked against.
Yeah, it's going to be a pretty unique group because they're going to be people that already want to donate data. So they're already going to have a very particular frame of mind, but then being able to ease that process somewhat to make it smoother for what more people to undertake the process. Is the goal.
Because the core concern that you get a fair bit of the literature is people going like, I want to donate my data because I think it's interesting, but like, I don't know what's in my data and I don't know what I'm giving over to people. So kind of being able to flag elements of it and being like, maybe don't send this to people because that's like your personal medical information.
Absolutely, but maybe it would be interesting to see also if, and this is maybe more in an experimental setting, if you allow people to better explore their own data before the donation, does that change the outcome? Exploring the data, understanding what they are donating, and being able to select themselves, maybe that can also change the outcome. And also doing a subgroup analysis would be interesting. So asking questions in a structured questionnaire and understand more about the people and see if there are certain types of people who are more likely to donate certain types of data versus others. That would be super interesting, yeah, and useful.
That's actually what our DGP team, Kelly, Lauren, Michael, working on. That's the problem we're trying to address. And it's an actual problem in the literature as well.
Yeah.
To address the issue of attrition in data donation studies, because the actual number of people who agree to go through the entire process, 18%, around 18% from all the enrollments.
Attrition and bias.
Yeah, bias, yes. So you only have a specific kind of people who are willing to donate. And then I guess that specific kind of people is not representative of the entire population.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily something that you want for your study.